I'm David Briggs, and this is a recording of a mini talk that I gave for a session called Teaching Colour Virtually, presented by the Study Group on Colour Education at the 14th AIC Congress, Milan 2021. 6 speakers were selected to talk about their approach to teaching colour online during the time of COVID. My public short course, Understanding and Applying Colour, was one of the first 4 online courses offered by the National Art School Sydney beginning in June 2020. The course had previously been given on campus with about 50% lecture content and 50% practical exercises. The lecture content was already in the form of PowerPoints and so translated readily to the online environment, and it was soon realised that the best way to conduct the practical component was as optional homework exercises based on instructions given at the end of each session. Students who wished to could email in photos of their homework for feedback during the first 30 minutes of the next session. The change had 2 positive outcomes. More time is now available for the lecture content, and the students, not all of whom want to undertake practical painting, can spend as much or as little time as they want on the practical exercises. The exercises progress from quite basic exercises complementing the theory through to simple studies applying the theory to painting. The theory component is copiously illustrated throughout, with the aim of introducing each concept initially as a perception. Session 1 looks at what exactly colour is a perception of, and then looks at the attributes of colour, starting with the most familiar ones of hue, lightness and chroma, and seeing how we can think of each of those as a dimension of a 3-dimensional colour space, and think of things like mixing of paints as following paths through that space. We also look at different scales that are used to specify those dimensions, such as different hue circles like the Munsell, the NCS and the traditional colour wheel. In session 2, we look closely at what we actually perceive when we look at illuminated objects, and then look at colorimetry, or scientific colour measurement. While this is quite unusual in a course primarily for painters, concepts from colorimetry come up again and again in the rest of the course in discussing lighting, the modern Munsell system, digital colour spaces and visual perception. In session 3, we look at the biology and physiology of colour vision, something that's very widely misrepresented in popular explanations of colour vision. And this leads on smoothly to the various physical mixing processes known as additive mixture, subtractive mixture, additive averaging and pointless mixture. Session 4 then looks at how this theory applies to mixing processes in actual paints, studying the characteristic mixing paths we see when we mix a coloured paint with a white paint, with a black paint, with a grey paint, or with paints of other hues. And we see how we can use this understanding to obtain an exact paint colour mixture quickly and efficiently. We then look at the properties of artist paints, things like transparency, light fastness, tinting strength and so on, and see what the spectral reflectances of paints tell us about the characteristics and mixing of different paints. In session 5, we look at what happens when objects reflect and transmit light, including the zones of light and shadow. We then introduce a couple of new attributes of colour, saturation, which is not the same as chroma, and brilliance, and show how these 2 concepts are important for anyone interested in evoking, in a painting, effects of illumination and luminosity. In session 6, we look at what happens when we change parameters like the direction of the light, the size of the light source, the number of light sources, the material properties of the object, the effect of an intervening atmosphere, and the effect of coloured illumination. We then explore how the visual system adapts to the colour of illumination and the related visual phenomena such as coloured shadows and after images. In Session 7, we explore the many aspects of visual perception that are relevant to painters, in particular colour constancy, our capacity to see an object as having a relatively consistent colour, how this is important to us for getting around in the world, but something that can create problems for us as painters. We then look at some failures of colour constancy that are also important to us as painters, such as simultaneous contrast and assimilation. In our final session, we review the subject of colour from a historical point of view, looking in particular at the foundations laid by Leonardo in the applied science of depicting visual appearances, and the development of our current understanding of the anatomy of colour and how this relates to the tenets of traditional so-called artistic or red, yellow, blue colour theory. And finally, this link gives up-to-date details on the course, which is currently offered to the general public 4 times a year, beginning in February, April, August and October.